Hey guys, today we're in the book of 2 Samuel chapter 21. Today we start with David back on the throne, but we instantly see that there's a problem. There's been a 3-year famine since the end of chapter 20, right? Remember, David beat Absalom, he takes back to the throne, and now there's a famine. And a famine happens every once in a while, but after 3 years, it starts to be a thing, right? Starts to be, what are we doing wrong? Is there sin? What's the issue? And that's why we see it says that David sought the face of the Lord. David earnestly prayed to see if there was sin, something going on. Was it his fault? Was it Israel's fault? Why was God not providing for them? And so he sought the face of the Lord. And after 3 years, the Lord answers and says, it's the blood guilt of Saul because he went against the Gibeonites. Now, we don't have in our record this war, this attack against the Gibeonites. It would have happened in 1 Samuel, but it's not in our Bible, but we have it here, so we know that it happened. And so David called the Gibeonites, and he spoke to them, and he said, now that the Gibeonites were not of the people of Israel, but the remnant of Amorites. And he says, what shall I do to you? Now, if you can remember a few months back, if you've been reading with us through the Old Testament, back in the book of Joshua chapter 9, the Gibeonites were the people who tricked Joshua and tricked Israel. They're the ones who put on the old clothes, the moldy bread, and came and said, we've come from afar, make a peace treaty with us. And they do, even though they were about 5 to 7 miles away. But even though they were tricked in a peace treaty of saying that Israel would never go against the Gibeonites. Now, they did trick them, so Israel brings them in, and they've been slaves to Israel, really slaves of the temple. If you remember back in Joshua, they were water carriers and board cutters, and they worked in and around the temple and worked for the priest. But here, Saul, almost 400 years later, breaks that promise, breaks that covenant, and he wipes out a bunch of Gibeonites. And so because Saul sinned, he broke the promise, he broke the covenant, and that's why the Lord is withholding rain, right? The famine also comes with water. It's why he's withholding. And so David, hearing this, he goes to them and says, what do you need? What do you need for us to rectify the situation? What will it take for the rest of the Gibeonites to bless Israel, to say that we are forgiven, that the Lord will hear that and see that, and the Lord will send us rain? What will it take? And the Gibeonites said, it's not money, it's not this, it's not that. And he said, here's what we want. We want 7 descendants of Saul. Right, Saul's already dead. He's come and gone, right? So he can't have him. And he says, we want 7 descendants. Now, to us, that sounds weird. To ancient Near East history, that was very common. It was very common for descendants or the sons and daughters of kings to pay the penalty of what their fathers did on the throne. And so he says, I'll give you 7 descendants. Well, the first immediate descendant is the guy that we know very well, Mephibosheth, right? This is the guy who has the messed up legs. He can't walk, the son of Jonathan. But David has already promised him peace in his palace, right? So it's not him. And so he skips him, but he goes into the next of some sons and some daughters of Saul, and he gives them over to the Gibeonites, and the Gibeonites do exactly what they said. They hung them from a tree on a mountain. And notice in verse 9, it says, before the Lord. That means that the Lord approves of what they did. Something needed to be rectified. The sin needed to be justified. And so the Lord was okay with this. And the mother of 2 of the people who got hung from the tree, Rizpah, she goes and she mourns. And notice it says, and she laid herself on a rock from the beginning of the harvest until rain fell, until the famine was over, until the Lord saw that the sin had been rectified, has been justified, and now he sends rain. And so he does that. But notice what David does. David hears of this, and what does he do? He goes and gets the bones of Saul, he gets the bones of Jonathan, and he brings them up to this mountain where the seven children of Saul are hanging, and he does a public burial, not only of the seven, but also with Saul and Jonathan. He basically makes a family grave on top of this tree so that they all could be together. And once again, I think that it shows us the heart of David. Even though Saul was wrong and they did all this, David continued to do what was right. Even though he's dead and gone, he did what was right. And so he brings them together, and we see in verse 14, and God responded to the plea of the land. Notice this, after the sin had been justified, what happens? The Lord answers the prayers for the land. For 3 years, Israel has been praying and praying and praying and praying, but it wasn't until the sin was removed that the Lord answers the prayer. We see the exact same thing in the book of James. It's our sins that hinder the Lord's response to our prayers. And so sometimes when we're praying and we're not getting answers, things are not getting resolved, it's a great place for us to look and to say, is there sin in my life? Is there sin between me and the Lord? The story goes on, and so after this, after some time, the Philistines come back on the scene and they begin to wage war against Israel. But notice this, David went down together with the servants and they fought against the Philistines, and David grew weary. David grew faint. David grew old. He's an old guy. He's too old to go into war, especially against these giants, against these Philistines. And it became so much that he was about to get taken out by a Philistine, but there was a Bashanay that comes and steps in and kills the giant that was going to kill David. And then we see that David's men, the mighty men, made David, and he says this, "You shall no longer go out with us." They threw David a retirement party. They said, "Hey, we appreciate the heart, but you're too old to move forward. We don't want you to get killed on the field. You need to stay at home in the castle, right, in the palace, and be the king and let us do the battles." And the rest of the chapter is just a war after war. And you read, and it's like Philistine after Philistine after Philistine after Philistine, war after war after war. But notice verse 22, the last verse. "These four were descended from giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of the servants." The rest of this chapter tells us that though David retired and he was no longer on the battlefield, Israel continued to excel. They continued to win wars without David on the battlefield. If you remember earlier in David's life, the battle fell because he wasn't on the battlefield. But now that he's old, the Lord understands, right? And there's things preparing. God is preparing things to change very soon. And so he is retired in the castle, but Israel continues to do well because they're doing the right thing. Hope that makes a little bit more sense, and we will see you tomorrow in chapter 22. God bless.